tripping over myself here.
If you're looking for a way to get stabilized handheld video with your phone or a GoPro, the Steadicam Volt is a pretty good choice for that. You can get vastly steadier footage than you could ever hope to achieve simply hand-holding the camera and relying on digital stabilization, since, let's be honest here, digital stabilization has a penchant for being incorrigibly crap. The Volt works well enough that not only can you disable digital stabilization entirely, but it stabilizes much better anyway. Overall, I'm pretty impressed by it, and I'm definitely glad I bought one. But it's not perfect. So let's give it a closer look. Ordinarily, I wouldn't comment on the packaging, as I feel that's not an important factor, unless it's noteworthily terrible. Since you usually just get rid of it as soon as you open it anyway, it doesn't have to be nice. But the box the Steadicam Volt comes in is actually quite spiffy. Inside you'll find the Volt itself, which folds up rather compactly, the batteries required to run it, a battery charger, a micro USB cable for the charger, which does not include an AC adapter, a set of counterweights, and an alternate mount for use with a GoPro. And it stores these components in such a space-efficient manner, and it's sturdy enough to provide sufficient protection, that the box is actually the most convenient way to store and transport everything. Though you may want to cut some air holes in the top, because it takes a long time to open. They also include this pouch, sack, bag thing that, frankly, I find confusing. It's made of a slick, stiff synthetic material that would be fine, except that it's slick and stiff enough that as soon as you pull the drawstring at the top to close it, it just slides back open. So you shove your Steadicam in there, and now you got this weird lumpy bag you gotta cart around, and you can't put anything else in it because it just loosely rattles around in there, and since it opens itself anyway, it's all just gonna fall out, and really, this is far less convenient than simply using the box. The Volt is made almost entirely out of plastic, which is fine. It doesn't feel expensive and luxurious the way brushed metal or anodized aluminum could. But being made of plastic does keep the cost and weight down, and it is entirely adequate for the task. It doesn't feel like an expensive piece of gear, but it certainly doesn't feel like it's going to shatter if you're not incredibly careful with it. They even greased the hinge joints where the counterweight arm pivots to fold up, which is nice, but they appear to have greased only one of them, which is odd. The small plastic clip that holds the metal brace to the counterweight arm takes a worrying amount of force to snap in place. Surely it's designed to take the required amount of force, but considering you have to do this every time you fold and unfold the Volt, it does make me wonder how well it will hold up to a couple of years of continuous use. If it does break, there doesn't appear to be any user-accessible way of replacing it, so if it broke outside of warranty, you might just be screwed, though if you had to, you could attach the brace some other way, like with tape, so it wouldn't render the Volt unusable. The grip is comfortable enough for prolonged use, but its design does encourage you to hold your hand farther up it with your thumb and index finger off the top. This is probably so that you can use them to guide the pan and tilt of the camera, but that's so much more comfortable and precise to do with your supporting hand that mostly it just causes them to be in the way. And if you hold your hand farther down it so that your thumb and index finger are on the grip, then the bottom of your hand will bump into the counterweight arm in certain positions, so that's not really a viable option. This is something I've gotten used to, and it doesn't bother me nearly as much as when I first started using it. The metal the grip is attached to has a warning label for heat on it, and it does indeed get warm after extended use, but nowhere near hot enough to warrant a warning. When adding counterweights for balancing, the first one threads in place, and any additional weights, if needed, magnetically attach to the first one. This is a really good idea, and it works perfectly. And the magnets are strong enough they're never going to fall off unintentionally. And it comes with enough counterweights to accommodate a very heavy phone. Even with the heaviest setup I've got, I only need half of them. They included a plastic cap for covering the mechanism when the handle is folded, and I leave it on there when not in use because the mechanism is so small that anything that keeps dust and other debris out of it is probably a good idea. The mechanism, at least the part that's visible, is a rack and pinion system, where the pinion is metal but the rack is plastic. It would be preferable if both parts were metal, simply for concerns of long-term durability. This mechanism is at work 100% of the time it's running, so it needs to stand up to quite a bit of wear. And how long will it last? Right now it's impossible to say. Will it stand up to 3 years of continuous use, or will it crap out after 6 months? The warranty is for 1 year, so it stands to reason that Tiffin is certain beyond any reasonable doubt that these will last at least a year, because they wouldn't want a ton of them coming back in within the warranty period, since that would cost them a lot of money. So we can be pretty certain these will last at least a year. But for $200, I'd like to see it last longer than that. Will it? I don't know. It's impossible to say. Only time will tell. The battery life is listed as 8 hours max, 5 hours typical. But based on my own real-world usage, 8 hours is preposterous. Unmitigated marketing wank. I don't know what abyssal hole they pulled that number out of, but don't think for a second you're getting 8 hours out of this. Even so, the 5 hours typical figure should be sufficient for most circumstances, and will pretty much always outlast your phone's battery, especially when shooting high-resolution, high-bitrate video, especially if you're shooting log or with the screen at max brightness to see in daylight. Unfortunately, in my experience, it's closer to about 2.5 hours. On one session of recording shots for this video, you can see the first one here was shot at 12:12, and the last at 3:01. That's less than 3 hours, and yet the low battery warning was on before I was done with the last shot. And that's not 3 hours of continuous runtime, because I turned the Steadicam off between shots. So the actual runtime in that just under 3 hours is closer to 2, maybe 2.5 hours. So either the low battery warning comes on when the battery is only half dead and has 2.5 hours left, or even the 5-hour figure is being more than a little economical with the truth. Theoretically, you can keep using it without battery power, and this is listed as a feature, but I don't recommend it at all. It doesn't stabilize nearly as well, and it's incredibly difficult to use without the motors assisting. This would result in shots inconsistent with the shots you made on battery power, which could result in a noticeable continuity problem. Also, you can't shoot in manual mode while the batteries are charging because the weight of the batteries themselves inside the Steadicam is essential to balancing. But the Volt has to have its batteries removed completely in order to charge them, so you can't just plug it in and keep going, though having a cable attached to it could affect stabilization, which is probably why they didn't offer that option. The upside of all of this is that they at least had the common decency to use a standard battery type. So if you need more than 2.5 hours, you can easily buy more of these batteries and just swap them out. And yeah, it's sad and grotesque that we have officially gotten to the point where a manufacturer using a standardized, user-replaceable battery is now a novelty, but that's the world we live in. At least it's not welded shut. The included battery charger seems to be of fairly low quality. It's extremely lightweight, and it doesn't hold onto the batteries with very much force. It uses micro USB, and you'll have to supply your own AC adapter because it doesn't come with one. It would be nice if it did, but most people likely have several of them for charging their various other devices. The benefit to using USB is that you can easily charge it from something like a power bank out in the field. When it comes to using the Volt, the first problem I encountered is that my phone is too lightweight. I'm using an iPhone SE, which weighs 112 grams, which is above the 100 gram minimum the Volt supposedly has. Even so, a plain SE can't be balanced properly, even with no counterweights added and the fine adjustment for the internal counterweight set as light as it goes. I wasn't particularly bothered by this because pretty much any time I record anything with my phone, I'm using the Moondog Labs Anamorphic lens, which is what I'm using here, and it adds quite a bit of weight to the phone. So I put that on there and found that now the phone could be balanced on that axis, but because the lens adds all the weight to only one side of the phone, it causes it to roll over on another axis. Obviously, I needed a counterweight. So I weighed the lens and found that it weighs 48 grams. I found that if I wrapped 2 stacks of 4/4 in electrical tape, it weighs 47 grams. And I can then attach that to the opposite side of the phone with a rubber band. Problem solved. This same counterweight can be attached to the center of the phone mount to increase the weight of a plain SE without the lens to a point where it can be balanced. The balancing process is a fiddly process that does prevent you from simply slapping in your phone and going, but it is essential to proper performance. The Volt is extremely sensitive to even the tiniest adjustments, so you can't just put the settings roughly where you had them the last time you used it. You will need to balance it every time you use it. This means that you can't just grab it and start recording on a moment's notice. You really do need to take the time to balance it properly, or performance will suffer. When you turn it on, it takes a few seconds to activate, but as soon as it does, you can feel the effect kick in. It's a very strange sensation at first, and you can feel the motors working against you. If you tilt the grip, it works to keep the platform level, and if you rotate the handle, it ignores that and keeps the platform facing the same direction. It works very well. In order to pan or tilt the camera, you have to exert force on the gimbal guide, and this is the part that takes a lot of practice. It takes an incredibly tiny amount of force to do this. It will continue coasting when you let go if you exert enough force, so if you're not careful, it can coast past the point where you want it to stop. You need to get used to exactly how much force it takes to move it around without jiggling or causing shake to come through the video. It's surprisingly sensitive. When you pan or tilt it, and then let go, that new position becomes the zero position that the motors work to maintain until you pan or tilt it again. It never re-zeros to a flat position, so if you tilt the camera up, it stays there. On the back of the Volt are 3 LEDs and a button. The left, red LED is an overload warning, and I've never seen it do anything, so I don't know what constitutes an overload. The green LED in the middle indicates that the Volt is in movie mode, and the blue LED on the right indicates that it's in sport mode and flashes as a low battery warning. The Volt always defaults to sport mode when you turn it on, but by double-clicking the button, you can switch to movie mode, where the motors exert much less force. This does make the Volt substantially harder to use, and Tiffin says it's to give advanced users more control, but sport mode to me just seems to work much better in all circumstances. Since the motors don't work as hard in movie mode, it could potentially increase battery life, but I haven't tested that. Pressing the button a single time returns to sport mode. To test the capabilities of the Volt, I tried to come up with shots that would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do handheld, just to see how much of a difference it makes. Rather than try to make these shots pretty or cinematic, I took a more utilitarian approach. I just wanted to benchmark the stabilization, so these shots really aren't very pretty. The outdoor lighting this time of year is extremely harsh, resulting in a dynamic range way beyond anything a phone can handle, so expect to see on-screen exposure adjustments, which normally I avoid at all costs, but for many of these the dynamic range was just too big to lock the exposure to one value. Also, the shutter speed is consistently way too high, but I don't have any neutral density filters to get the proper 180-degree shutter angle. And again, the point here is the stabilization, not my incredibly limited cinematography skills, so please excuse the bland and utilitarian nature of these shots. There's also no digital stabilization in any of these shots, even the handheld ones. Normally you'd have that enabled when shooting handheld, but since I had it turned off for the Steadicam shots, I left it turned off when I switched to handheld, just to have the most direct comparison possible of exactly how much difference the Volt was making. To start with, I decided to try the Volt inside a moving car, and this worked surprisingly well. We were on a winding, uneven back road, and I still got a steady shot. If you were on a flat, well-maintained road, this wouldn't pose a problem at all. On the way back, I filmed the same stretch of road handheld, and the difference should be immediately obvious. I did notice after a few minutes of driving around curves, the Volt seemed to lose its zero position and became slightly rolled out of level. When we stopped and I turned it off, the next time I turned it on, it did find its normal zero. I think this was a fluke since I've never had it happen again, but I think it's worth noting that it did happen once. And since it worked so well in a car, why not try it on a motorcycle? This, too, worked better than I anticipated, but not perfectly. The limiting factor on the motorcycle is not unsteadiness, but wind resistance. The flat surface of the phone caught the wind, which pushed it back, causing it to pan upwards. So for the shots on the motorcycle, I am having to hold onto the gimbal guide to prevent this, which is introducing some shake into the footage, so it's not perfectly steady. Even so, it's still surprisingly smooth for such a difficult situation. For comparison, the completely handheld shot is a shaky mess. Another good test I thought of was to hop a fence, something that would look terrible handheld. The shot remains steady and level, and as I turn my whole body sideways to clear the fence, the camera just smoothly floats over it. There is some noticeable wobble caused by the phone mount, which I'll talk more about later, but overall it's a gigantic improvement over completely handheld. Here's a shot of me jumping off a ledge that's about 3 or 4 feet tall, and it looks pretty smooth for what is actually a fairly hard landing. Running through the sharp turns of a corn maze worked extremely well. Some of the pans are a little sloppy, but that's my fault operating it, not something the Volt itself was doing. If I had actually rehearsed it a few times instead of just shooting it, I could have gotten better results. Perhaps the most impressive is how it handled climbing a very steep, uneven surface, like this hill here. What might not translate on video very well is how steep this surface actually is. It's steep enough that I could barely get sufficient traction, and I was having to use my free hand to help. Yet, you can see the shot remains impressively steady for such incredibly harsh terrain. It's unlikely you would even need to shoot on a surface this steep and rough, but I wanted to gauge the Volt's abilities past normal usage. I did the same climb again handheld, and you can see how disastrous the results are. While focusing on trying to climb, it proved very difficult to keep the camera facing forward, and the shot would be unusable for any purpose other than the illustration I'm making here. Now, after all this positivity, let's talk about the phone mount. The foldability of the phone mount is nice for portability, but it is the single greatest weakness in the entire product's design. The reason being that the mount is able to tilt independently of the platform it's on, resulting in a wobbling shot, even if the platform is totally stable. Ideally, the presence of the phone itself in the mount should prevent the mount from moving rearward, but as long as there's room for the mount to open farther, it can simply open up and accommodate the tilt. So, with a phone that's the maximum supported width, this might be less of a problem, and you could compensate for this with something like a rubber band that held this forward, but point is I shouldn't have to do that. This would work so much more reliably if it had something like a spring-loaded ball detent that snapped in place, or a locking lever you could crank down to securely clamp it in place. And this really is only a problem when sprinting or on particularly harsh terrain. Under normal conditions like walking or even careful jogging, it's fine. But there are times where I'd love to sprint with this thing on harsh terrain, and it has a problem with that. Even though the stabilization itself can handle that, the mount can't. And that's irritating. Another huge problem is that the phone is able to slide side to side in the mount. You'd think the high-friction rubber pads would hold it in place really well, but even the most minuscule movement to either side can throw it out of balance and reduce performance. Of course, the SE being the narrowest supported size doesn't help. Springs don't exert an equal amount of force across their entire range of compression, so a much wider phone would likely be held in place much better. I did find a way to make it hold the phone better, by using a lens cap to increase the width and thus make the springs exert more force. Another problem is that the phone can rotate out of horizontal level inside the mount, resulting in a shot that's not level, even if the rest of the Steadicam is level. Contributing to this is the fact that the rubber pad on the top of the mount is narrower than the one on the bottom. The wider these pads are, the more difficult it would be for the phone to rotate in the mount, so the top one should be at least as wide as the bottom one. Overall, though, I am thoroughly impressed by the Steadicam Volt's stabilization. It will allow me to get the kinds of shots I've always wanted to get, but have consistently been dissatisfied with when I've tried them handheld. It can't work miracles, and it's not going to give you perfect results in every situation, the wind on the motorcycle and the wobbling of the mount when sprinting being good examples of clear limitations it has. But hopefully my description and examples have given you a realistic understanding of how well it works, from which you can ascertain whether or not it will serve your purposes.